It's great to have so many visitors with us today. Some of you may be old members whom I haven't met yet, but I'm so glad that you've come to worship with us today. Somewhat providentially, Ruth in Adult Sabbath School showed a DVD on the solar system, and Tabo has also shared a story on the solar system with the children, and none of that was colluded. My topic this morning, of course, is on creation. On Christmas Eve, 1968, the astronauts of Apollo 8 orbited around the moon for the first time. Buzz Aldrin, Jim Lovell and Frank Borman. And they took a photograph looking back at our little planet Earth from the orbit of the moon. And on that evening, Christmas Eve, 1968, they read the all too familiar words that you know from your Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And now the earth was formless and empty, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning the first day. And so they read on until the end of day 3 of creation. The subject of origins is one that for Christians living in the 21st century is one that we are confronted with almost on a daily basis. With the rest of our contemporary society, questions the very authenticity of the biblical story of the origins of life on our planet. Any young person who has ever left high school and gone to a secular university knows that it doesn't take very long, whatever discipline they study, it doesn't take very long before they are confronted with the challenges that evolutionary science brings to the Christian thought. So this morning I wanted to look at the subject of origins with you, and particularly our text from Genesis chapter 1. Because for nearly 2,000 years, Western Christian thought was dominated by the belief, based on Scripture, that God indeed created our world in 6 days. And all of Western life, if you like, was governed by that belief. It influenced our society, our culture, more than we could ever imagine. Because the moment you talk about a creator, you immediately imply that there is accountability, there is moral accountability. And with a belief in a creator goes hand in hand an expectation of what he wants for his creation. And so the laws that governed life for most of our ancestors revolved around the biblical record of God and his relationship with mankind throughout the centuries. And for the ancient people, for many, for the best part of that 2 millennia, for our ancestors, our Earth was the centre of the universe. We call that a geocentric view of cosmology. The Earth was at the centre, and the rest of life, as we could see it in the heavens, revolved around us. And if you go back far enough, they thought it was a flat Earth. But of course, Christopher Columbus put spell to that with his explorations to the New World. But it was perhaps this man who challenged that view of a geocentric view of cosmology more than anybody else. This is Nicholas Copernicus. He was a Russian monk, but also an astronomer and a mathematician. And he lived in the early 1500s. He came to the conclusion from his studies with his little telescope, and compared with what he had, the technology he had available to him today, most of us would be able to see the same things that he saw just with a pair of binoculars. But he came to the conclusion from his studies that indeed the earth was not the centre of the universe, but the sun was. And that became known as a heliocentric view of the cosmos. But his views were not held in very high regard by the church of the day. And he left it right up till his deathbed before he published a little book known as The Revolutions of the Celestial Spheres. That's the English translation of it. He waited till his deathbed because the moment the book was published, of course, the church put it on a list of banned books to read. He was considered a heretic, and his views flew in the face of nearly 2,000 years of Aristotelian Greek cosmology, where the earth was the centre of the universe. About 80 years later, an Italian man by the name of Galileo Galilei, also from his own studies with a much more powerful telescope than Copernicus had at his disposal, came to the same conclusion, that indeed the earth was not the centre of the universe, but neither was the sun. The sun was the sun was the centre of our solar system, and our solar system was a part of a galaxy within the universe. Galileo was brought to trial by the church for his views, forced to recant his publications, and placed on house arrest for the rest of his life. But of course, it didn't take too long for the rest of the world and the rest of the scientific community to wake up to the fact that Galileo was right. And within about 100 years, the church was forced to backtrack, and his book was also put on the list of banned books. The church was red-faced, was forced to backtrack and admit that Galileo was right. But the cat was out of the bag, and the church was made to look like a fool in the face of science. And over the next 200 years, be it in astronomy, geology, physics, biology, chemistry, and soon to be the science of archaeology, educated Western minds came to realise that our Earth, by the evidence that they had, our Earth was much older than the 6,000 years that Bishop Ussher proposed in his chronology of life on Earth. With the developments in technology and exploration, particularly from European nations, exploration around the world, mankind's, if you like, view of life on this planet began to gradually change. Perhaps no one, by the early 1800s, nearly all of the scientific community accepted a longer age of the earth than the Bible puts forward. Perhaps no one did more to damage the creation story than this man, Charles Darwin, with his publication, The Origin of Species. And by the late 1800s, the views that he had propagated in his book became widely accepted in the universities of the world. And around the same time, there was also a group of theologians in Germany that were actually pulling the very texts apart that made up the Bible that we have today. And they called that higher criticism. And they were questioning the very authenticity of the document that so many Christians had placed their faith upon over the years. And no longer in the public circle was the Bible held in the esteem that it was before. And now it seemed that the empirical evidence of science had become the god of the new age, of the modern age. And perhaps the one question that was foremost in everyone's minds was the belief in a creation of our world in 6 days. Was our world created in 6 days? And this became, if you like, the standing point of or argument between those who believed in a creator God and those who rejected the biblical story of creation. How is it possible for God to have created our world in 6 days? Just this week in Kentucky, in America, Ken Ham, a former Australian, now living in America, and the head of the Answers in Genesis Foundation, opened his life-size replica ark at a Christian theme park, and it's known as the Ark Encounter. This is the first time the world has had a full-scale model of the ark constructed. And it is Ken's hope that when people come to see this ark, that they will be introduced to the creation story. But again, in the media, this has created, particularly in America, this has created a lot of argument and a lot of debate, again, of the issue of creation and the origin of life on our planet. When theologians talk about creation from a biblical perspective, they use the term ex nihilo, meaning out of nothing. It's the Latin for out of nothing. That God created the universe and our world out of nothing. That he spoke the world into existence. And the author of the book of Hebrews in the New Testament actually writes this, where he says, by faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what is visible. Is that blind faith on our part to expect that God could speak the world into existence? I don't believe God asks us to have a blind faith. When Jesus was on this planet, he upheld and taught the creation story. And to the people of his own day, when they questioned him about the realities of the afterlife and the resurrection, he said to them, "You are in error because you do not know the Scriptures or the power of God." Now, if God is the creator, and I'm very comfortable to tell you that I believe he is, if God is the creator, who are we to limit his ability to create in any length of time? Either God spoke the world into existence or he didn't. Either Scripture is right or it isn't. And Jesus accepted the biblical story. And I take Jesus' example in accepting that in faith. But that is something that God doesn't want you to just believe blindly, to put your faith blindly. God has given evidence of his creative power and his creativity in the world around us. And so we began our reading this morning in Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And in our little study this morning, I want to focus on, I don't want to enter into the argument of the age of the earth or the length of God's ability to create it, because I already believe that God can create, and God can create in 6 days. What I want to look at this morning is the structure of Genesis chapter 1, because it is a story that is unlike any other that we know from our modern perspective. Just last Sabbath afternoon, went out to Westwood with the young people who are running the best part of a kids' VBS out there with the children from the local community at Westwood. Thanks to Iona and Nicole and their children, connecting with the community there. And I sat there, and we're doing the creation story. Our youth are sharing the creation story with the young children at Westwood. And I was sitting there, we put a big mat out on the ground for them, and the kids come and sit around, we tell stories, sing songs. And Tabo usually does his best with his little laptop to show them some of those pictures that he showed the children this morning. And I was sitting there on the outside with the rest of the parents of those children, listening to Iona share the creation story. And I thought, you know, from a child's perspective, it sounds really interesting. But I was wondering, what would the adults be thinking of this story right now? And when we look at Genesis chapter 1, we find a story that is unique to any other in all of our written form of communication with one another. There's something you need to understand about the ancient people who lived at the time that the book of Genesis was composed. The ancient people believed, yes, that the earth was flat. They didn't yet have the technology to know that it was round, or that the earth wasn't the centre of the universe. They believed the earth was flat. That the earth was dominated by water beneath and water above. And somehow there was a firmament that kept the water above them. And in that firmament were the starry hosts of the heavens, the moon, sun, stars and planets. That was a belief that was held by the ancient people who lived in the Middle East around the time of Moses, living himself in Egypt. This was common cosmology for an ancient person. I mention that to you because the story that is communicated to us in Genesis uses ancient cosmology to tell a spiritual lesson. It was not written as a scientific document. It was written to make a theological viewpoint. And that's very important for us to understand. I want you to consider the 6 days of creation, the first 6 days of creation. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And on the first day, God said, "Let there be light." God was creating light from darkness. And the Bible tells us that he calls it night and day. On the second day, God separates the waters above and the waters below. And this is still in keeping with ancient cosmology. The ancient people would have read the story so far and gone, we get it. Then on the third day, land appears and God puts vegetation on this land. What has God done so far in the first 3 days of creation? He has created spaces, and in the next 3 days, he fills those spaces. So that on day 4, he fills the heavens with the moon, the sun, and the stars. On day 5, he fills the waters and the sky with birds and fish. And on day 6, he fills the land with animals. And so in the creation week, we have gone from chaos and darkness at the beginning to life and light at the end. And you may be forgiven for thinking that the creation of mankind on day 6, after the animals, is the climax of creation. It was actually the creation of womankind. No, just joking. The climax of creation is not mankind. The climax of creation is the Sabbath day. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Now, for the ancient people, this document, to have seen the sun created on the 4th day, would have been absolutely incredulous. Because for them, the sun was the source of all life. And the fact that the writer of Genesis placed it on the 4th day, he was making a statement. You see, the ancient people believed, as much as there was a dome above the earth, the ancient people believed that the gods themselves were products of some primordial swamp on this planet. And that those gods were just as fickle and selfish and self-centered as we are as human beings today. And that those gods created on this planet through a process of conflict and annihilation of one another, and death and resurrection of those gods. And that you and I are just mere pawns of the gods on this planet. That was their belief system. The sun was the ultimate source of all life to the ancient people. And so for the writer of Genesis to say, God spoke the world into being, and that God is the source of light, and that he didn't create the sun until the fourth day, flew in the face of their ancient cosmology and understanding of the world around them. So notice the story is encouched in their belief system around the physical makeup of the universe, but it teaches a spiritual lesson that would have been almost beyond their comprehension, that God could speak the world into existence. God is both above the creation, but also and intimately a part of the creation. I mentioned to you that the Sabbath is the climax of creation, because in the Sabbath, previously God created 3 spaces and then he filled those spaces. On the Sabbath, he created a space in time. Or as the Jewish rabbi Abraham Herschel refers it to, a cathedral in time that comes to all mankind on the planet over a 24-hour period. You see, it was God's desire to dwell with man in that space and time on the Sabbath. The climax of creation is resting with God in his creation and enjoying fellowship with him. That is the story that Genesis 1 wants to communicate to you and I today. I don't even have the time to go into the arguments for intelligent design. But the irony is that the more the scientific community has engaged with the created order around us, the stronger their microscopes become, the bigger their telescopes become. There are scientists in this world who are waking up to the fact that life on this planet could not exist without intelligent design. And if you want to see some interesting resources that are available on this subject, you only have to go to any Christian bookstore. Increasingly, scientists are coming to the conclusion that life could not exist on this planet without intelligent design. I don't have time to go into that this morning. John Ashton, a doctor of chemistry, works for Sanitarium in Cooranbong, was once told by a former student of his that in university he had heard that a lecturer say, the lecturer said, "I don't know anybody with a PhD in any discipline of science who believes in creation." And John thought, "I know quite a few." And so he emailed out his friends and colleagues in the scientific community whom he knew were creationists. And by the time he'd finished, he compiled a book of 50 PhD scientists, biologists, chemists, physicists, mathematicians, all of whom believe in intelligent design and have very good reasons for doing so. I don't even have time to go into that argument with you this morning. But when we think about the origins of life, how does it impact us as Seventh-day Adventists here in the 21st century? How does this issue of the origins of life impact you and I? Because what you believe about the origins of life will determine almost everything else and every other decision you make in your life. The Bible is clear that God made this earth for a purpose, to share and commune with mankind. The Bible tells us where we came from. It tells us why we're in the mess that we're in now. And it tells us what God is going to do to rescue our planet from the current sin and decay that it's in. If you don't believe that, if you are anchored in what the world tells us to believe, that life on this earth is a matter of pure random chance, then there is no future, there is no hope, there is no purpose. There is no absolute morality. Morality comes down to whatever works for you, whatever gets you through the night. For Seventh-day Adventists, this is a very important topic. There are two things that I want to share with you this morning. Very soon, regardless of the outcome of the federal election, very soon our country is going to face a referendum on the issue of marriage equality. Now, if you believe the biblical record that God created man and woman on this planet and brought them together as husband and wife for the purpose of procreation, then you know that the very foundation of our society is a heterosexual marriage. Right now, around the world, and soon in Australia, that very foundation is going to be called into question. That's one impact that the theory of origins will have on our community. And the second is for us, as Seventh-day Adventists, we believe that the Sabbath is going to be a critical issue in the near future for us. And our belief in the Sabbath is tied to the creation story. Our belief that God created in 6 literal days and rested on the Sabbath, as is maintained by the 4th commandment. For in 6 days God created the heavens and the earth and all that's in them. Our belief is anchored in that. If you write off the story of creation, you write off our purpose for observing the Sabbath. I've spent a lot of time with you in the last few months ploughing through the book of Revelation and some of the issues that we will face in the future over the Sabbath. But none of that makes any sense unless we are grounded in our belief in the authenticity of the Bible record of creation and the Sabbath. I don't think it's any coincidence that when John, the disciple, was inspired to write his gospel, he began with the very words that almost sound like Genesis 1, verse 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Allow me to read a few of these verses for you from John chapter 1. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, but the darkness has not understood it. Verse 10, he was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who received him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision, or a husband's will, but born of God. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. 2,000 years ago, the God who spoke this world into existence came to live on this planet with you and I for one purpose and one purpose alone: to reconnect with that relationship that had been lost in the Garden of Eden. And he gave his life for you and I. Now, I don't know about you, I wouldn't be prepared to give my life over an argument on the origin of this world did I not have a relationship with the Creator of this world. But having a relationship with the Creator makes it all possible. It makes it possible for you and I to stand up for what we believe in, because we do not believe in airy-fairy stories. We believe in a God who came as a man, historically recorded, lived on this earth and died for you and I. Now that's the sort of God that I could stand up in the face of any challenge, of any scientific evidence that someone may want to throw my way. That's someone I can lay my life down for. How about you?